Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, Nicholas II, the last Russian autocrat, is a controversial and tragic figure. Some saw him as kind and gentle, others as indifferent and cruel. He was a devoted husband and father, yet among the people he was called Nicholas the Bloody. He wasn't born to rule, but he couldn't resist divine will and diligently served Russia, which rejected him. Many consider his life, especially the final stretch, a chain of fatal, irreparable mistakes. Russia's forgotten years, the last 5 years. 5 years before the fall of the last reigning family, the Russian Empire celebrated the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. The celebrations began in Petersburg on February 21, 1913. Such a jubilee of the imperial house was held for the first time in 3 centuries. Hardly anyone could have guessed that the first time would also be the last. The days were sunny, almost spring-like. The Jubilee was celebrated with grandeur. For 4 whole days, there were solemn prayers, dazzling balls, and lavish receptions not only in Petersburg, but also in Moscow and throughout the provinces. It was the last year of an era that in Russia and all of Europe would be considered the good old days. In May 1913, the celebration continued. The royal family embarked on a 2-week journey to historical sites associated with the Romanovs' ascension. They visited ancient Russian cities like Vladimir, Suzdal, Yaroslavl, Rostov, Nizhny Novgorod, and Kostroma. It was from Kostroma in 1613 that Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov was called to the throne. The emperor and his family stayed here for a few days. They visited the Ipatiev monastery where Mikhail lived. In honor of the 300th anniversary of the Romanov house, a monument was laid in the highest presence. Crowds of people joyfully greeted the Father Tsar and Mother Tsarina. The Tsar, who was an excellent rider, rode from the station on a golden horse. On one side of his path stood troops in parade uniform, on the other, the people. As everywhere in Moscow, numerous prayers were held. Nicholas was filled with optimism. The celebrations seemed nationwide, and autocracy appeared unshakable. In this, the Tsar was mistaken. The Romanov house was simply lucky with the Jubilee year. The industrial boom of previous years and 2 consecutive bountiful harvests made 1913 the most prosperous economically in all 300 years. Successes were showcased at several industrial and agricultural exhibitions, the largest of which, the All-Russian, was held that summer in Kiev. During Nicholas's reign, many enterprises, shipyards, and railways were built. Not only cars became commonplace, but even airplane flights ceased to amaze. Nicholas himself patronized the St. Petersburg Aero Club. In once wooden Russia, multi-story buildings with all amenities, including telephone communication, were being built. Tram lines were laid in cities. Photography became part of everyday life. Nicholas was quite fond of it. Cinema was gaining increasing popularity. One of the films successfully shown in theaters at the time was dedicated to the 300th anniversary of the Romanov house. Mikhail Romanov, after hesitations, agrees to become the Moscow Tsar. The authority of many Russian scientists was very high. Physiologist Ivan Pavlov was awarded the Nobel Prize. The Silver Age of Russian art was in full swing. The new Russian theater triumphantly entered the world stage. The names of Fyodor Chaliapin, Vaslav Nijinsky, Anna Pavlova, and Konstantin Stanislavski gained. Worldwide fame. The public was captivated by the brilliant works of Russian artists of the new wave. However, many at the time compared Russia to the steamship Titanic, whose passengers merrily danced on deck while the hold was already filling with water. The progress of the Russian economy and culture sharply contrasted with the lack of political progress. The need to solve state problems weighed heavily on Nicholas. He preferred interacting with military ranks. Six years had passed since Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin proclaimed a very moderate reform program. After his assassination in 1911, almost all his plans perished. One reason was that Nicholas did not sympathize with many of Stolypin's initiatives. The Tsar had long been tormented by the thought that he had committed a grave sin by allowing the creation of a legislative State Duma and proclaiming political freedoms under the pressure of the 1905 revolution. His dream was to return to the old order, Like medieval monarchs, he was sincerely convinced of the divine nature of his power and personality. While readily enjoying the benefits of civilization, Nicholas was inwardly committed to patriarchal traditions. The crowds that enthusiastically greeted him in 1913 strengthened his belief that he could and should rule alone. Until the end of his days, he would not understand that his faith in the people's boundless love was purely mystical and did not correspond to reality. During the Jubilee celebrations, traditional rumors spread among the peasants that they would be granted land. In the Duma, peasant deputies called for the free transfer of state lands to peasants and the redemption of privately owned lands. Thus, blind faith in the Tsar actually clashed with the desire to obtain land, including the Tsars. And this was not the only political collision. The proclaimed political freedoms were absent, the workers' situation was dire, and the problems of national outskirts were unresolved. Even in the prosperous 13th year, about 2 million workers went on strike, and in July 14th, it came to barricades in Petersburg. But the year 1914 brought Russia the threat not only of revolution, but also of war. The Tsar's government paid increased attention to preparing the Russian army. Many in the upper echelons hoped that the war would dispel revolutionary sentiments. Nicholas shared these hopes. This was another delusion. In February 1914, former Minister of the Interior Pyotr Durnovo sent the Tsar a prophetic note. In the event of failures in the war with Germany, Durnovo warned, a social revolution in its most extreme forms is inevitable in Russia. Russia will be plunged into hopeless anarchy. But the Tsar, as usual, did not heed wise advice. He considered the governance of Russia a purely family affair of the Romanovs. On July 19, 1914, Russia learned from the Tsar's manifesto about the start of the war. The next day, a huge crowd gathered in front of the Winter Palace. When Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna appeared on the balcony, a thunderous hurrah echoed across the square. The Tsar wanted to say something, but the noise of the crowd prevented him. He lowered his head and stood silently, experiencing the solemnity of the moment. It seemed that Russia heard the Tsar's call for unity. To many, the war seemed like a way out of the political deadlock. The people were gripped by anti-German sentiments. There were no attempts to evade mobilization anywhere. Picky commissions selected the best horses for the army. Many private individuals and firms provided their cars for the needs of the front. In the provinces, as in the capital, a wave of patriotic demonstrations swept through. One of the largest took place in Yekaterinburg, the city where the Tsar's life would end 4 years later. At special sessions of the Duma and the State Council on July 26th, all political parties, except the left-wing Social Democrats, expressed their readiness to rally around the autocratic power. Nicholas seized the moment and suspended the activities of the legislative chambers for a year. The Minister of the Interior, Nikolai Maklakov, wrote in delight, "Now neither the Duma nor the parties are a threat to us." Russia returned to absolutism, and initially, this was justified by the military successes of the Russian army. In August-September, the Russians defeated the Austrians in Galicia. They occupied the capital of eastern Galicia, Lviv, and besieged the fortress of Przemysl. The number of Austrian prisoners of war was in the hundreds of thousands. Their fate was not particularly harsh. The Russian army and the local population showed magnanimity and sympathy. On the German front, things weren't going so well. But here, too, trying to make up for General Samsonov's army's defeat in East Prussia, the Russians resumed offensive actions in the fall. The initial military actions against Turkey were successful. The emperor and his close circle, led by the supreme commander, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the Tsar's uncle, were confident that Russia's victory was a matter of months. The war hardly affected the home front, except for large demonstrations and fundraising for the army. The country had not yet experienced food shortages. In 1914, Russia was the only warring country that didn't have to worry about bread supplies. Before the war, it was the largest grain exporter in the world, exporting 600 to 700 million poods annually. Against this backdrop, news of bread rationing in Germany was seen as another sign of the enemy's impending collapse. Meanwhile, Russia faced a more severe shortage in military supplies. By September 1914, the Supreme Commander was informed that many operations were stalled due to a lack of shells. With a monthly consumption of 1 million shells, Russian factories produced only 100,000. By winter, the mobile war ended, and a continuous front was established. Although it was clear the war was dragging on, improving army supplies was still not possible, yet few realized the danger of the situation. One of the few was former Prime Minister Sergei Witte, who openly advocated for ending the war. However, in February 1915, Witte passed away. His warnings of impending disasters for Russia went unheeded. A dire sign was the acute shortage of oats, which the country and army suddenly felt at the beginning of 1915. But even then, the authorities showed little concern. In the spring, the Russian army achieved a major victory. On March 9, 1915, after a 4-month siege, the Austrian fortress of Przemysl surrendered. 17,000 enemy soldiers were captured. Everyone in Russia believed that eastern Galicia was conquered forever. In April, Nicholas II himself arrived in Lviv. He met with the city's new authorities, visited a local church, and attended a parade. Then the Tsar headed to Przemysl, where he inspected the heavily damaged fortifications. Just a week later, the situation on the front would change dramatically. On April 18th, Austro-German forces launched a major offensive, using their overwhelming artillery superiority. Many Russian units lost more than half of their strength. Among the defeated was the division of such a brave general as Laver Kornilov, who himself was captured. In a short time, the Russians were forced to abandon not only Galicia, but also part of the Russian Empire itself, the Kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, parts of the Baltic states, and Belarus. For the first time since the Napoleonic invasion, the country heard the words evacuation and refugees. And then the darkest predictions began to come true. Patriotic demonstrations were replaced by strikes and protest demonstrations. At the end of May 1915, serious unrest broke out in Moscow. On June 5th, the police shot at a demonstration in Kostroma, where just 2 years ago, thousands had welcomed the Romanovs. Now the Russian people, traditionally ready to blame the authorities for everything, suspected them of colluding with the Germans and outright treason. Various social groups demanded changes in the government from the Tsar and the swift convening of the State Duma. The Tsar couldn't withstand the pressure and decided to yield. Several ministers were dismissed, and the Duma was convened. Nicholas hoped these formal concessions would allow him to retain power. But his retreat did not satisfy his opponents. They wanted more radical changes. When the State Duma sessions resumed on July 19th, for the first time since 1907, it voted by a majority to limit autocratic power. Almost all newly appointed ministers and Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich leaned towards an agreement with the opposition. But then Nicholas decided to show firmness. Removing his uncle from his position, the emperor became the supreme commander himself on August 23rd. Ten days later, he suspended the sessions of both chambers of the Duma and then dismissed those ministers who were for concessions to the Duma's opposition bloc. Unwilling to sacrifice a little, the Tsar ultimately lost everything. His personal power increased, but he found himself in a more dangerous situation than in 1905. The country's situation continued to deteriorate rapidly. Now, only Nicholas was held responsible for everything. At this moment, forced to leave the capital for the Stavka in the city of Mogilev, the Tsar lost the ability to fully control the situation in the country. Russia had never before seen such a number of killed, wounded, and captured. By August 1915, there were over 4 million. Hospitals were opened on almost every street in Moscow and Petrograd, even in the Winter Palace. At every major station, there was a sanitary train. In cities and villages, disabled people, widows, and orphans were increasingly encountered. Russia faced a shortage of the most essential items for the first time. Food prices rose 3 to 4 times compared to pre-war times. Queues became a new feature of Russian reality. Soon they turned into a kind of political clubs, according to gendarme reports, equivalent in influence to revolutionary rallies and thousands of proclamations. In queues, the Tsar and Tsarina were increasingly and loudly criticized. Never had the authority of the Russian monarch been so low as in 1916. The situation on the fronts remained difficult. Last year's Austro-German offensive was stopped with great difficulty. Some Russian troops had to be sent to the Greek port of Salonika. Together with allies, they were to help Serbia repel a new Austrian offensive. France demanded that members of the Duma visiting Paris send 40,000 Russian soldiers to the Western Front every month. Nicholas couldn't agree to this, but a small contingent still arrived in France. Many in Russia believed that the Tsar's presence in the active army positively influenced the course of military actions. At the beginning of 1916, good news came from the Caucasian Front, now commanded by Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. The Russians captured the Turkish fortress of Erzurum. In May, the Southwestern Front, led by General Brusilov, launched a successful offensive against the Austrians in Volhynia and Galicia. Between these events, Nicholas had perhaps the last opportunity to ease political tension. Since the situation was not conducive to opposition speeches, he decided to take a step towards the hostile majority of the Duma without changing the policy in essence. The Tsar dismissed the unpopular Prime Minister Ivan Goromykin and allowed the Duma sessions to resume. But Russia was too tired of the war. and neither private military successes nor relative political stabilization could change this. Reports of unrest came from all corners of the empire. Plans to suppress uprisings were developed like military operations. Society's indignation was exacerbated by the fact that the Tsar continued to consider governing Russia his personal affair and ignored the legislative chambers of the government, not to mention the entire population of the empire. When Nicholas became the supreme commander, he effectively entrusted all state affairs to the Empress. "It is your duty to maintain harmony and unity among the ministers," he wrote to his wife, not caring that such actions violate the law. Alexandra Feodorovna soon began to command both the ministers and the autocrat himself. Her letters to Nicholas were full of instructions, from changes in the cabinet to setting tram fares. Yet, according to competent assessments, the Tsarina was ignorant of basic concepts of state order. She herself had no doubts, as her friend Grigory Rasputin advised her. Both Nicholas and Alexandra sincerely believed in the holiness of the elder, thanks to his magical ability to ease the suffering of the hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei. A semi-literate rogue, drunkard, and debauchee, Rasputin gained enormous influence at court. For the Tsarina, his word was law, and she knew how to bend the Tsar to her will. Rasputin's influence was especially evident in the appointment of high-ranking officials. The criterion was not talent, competence, or integrity, but solely loyalty. In 1916, almost every appointment in the cabinet of ministers provoked public protest. The Tsarina's loyal appointees of Rasputin were either ignorant of state affairs or involved in scandals. But the Tsar was not bothered. He even admitted that he deliberately chose those whom public opinion hated. By the end of 1916, according to monarchist and nationalist Vasily Shulgin, the country was mortally afraid of its own government. Opposition leader Pavel Milyukov, evaluating the government's actions, used the words stupidity and treason. Even the far-right Black Hundred member Vladimir Purishkevich exclaimed that all evil comes from the dark forces led by Grishka Rasputin. On the night of December 17th, Purishkevich, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and Prince Felix Yusupov, the husband of the Tsar's niece, killed Rasputin. The Tsar was outraged, but the general rejoicing prevented him from seriously punishing the murderers. The princes were exiled from the capital, and Purishkevich was not even arrested. The royal couple was left alone. with a small handful of personal friends and close associates. All state institutions, even the most conservative, insisted on the creation of a government of trust, composed of people trusted by the country, not just the emperor. Members of the royal family also requested the same. The eldest of the family, Grand Duke Pavel Alexandrovich, and the Empress's sister, Elizabeth Feodorovna. The latter even quarreled with Alexandra and, leaving, reminded her of the sad fate of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Prime Minister Nikolai Golitsyn warned the Tsar and Tsarina that their lives were in danger. Proto-presbyter of the Army and Navy Georgy Shchevelsky reported that even in the Guard there were talks of a coup and a change of the ruling dynasty. But Nicholas and Alexandra remained fatalists and did nothing. They relied on God's will and believed that the Russian people would not betray them. The august couple did not know that hundreds of congratulatory letters and telegrams, supposedly from ordinary people, were organized by the police. The Tsar and Tsarina completely lost touch with the sentiments gripping the people and, most importantly, the army. The army became unreliable both at the front and in the rear. About 200,000 soldiers gathered in Petrograd, having no desire to go to the front. The Petrograd garrison considered the continuation of the war useless. During the October strike, the soldiers supported the workers. But even this alarming signal was not heard by Nicholas. On February 22, 1917, he left Tsarskoye Selo, where he had come to see his family, and departed for Mogilev. On that very day, the huge Putilov factory was closed, and 30,000 workers found themselves on the street. The next day, demonstrations and strikes began in Petrograd with slogans, "Down with the autocracy" and "Down with the war." It was a revolution. On February 25th in Mogilev, the Tsar was informed of the unrest in the capital. He telegraphed, "I order the disturbances to be stopped immediately." Like all uprisings, he considered the events to be ordinary disturbances. On the 26th, the Tsar ignored the desperate telegram from the chairman of the Duma, Mikhail Rodzianko. The situation is serious. Any delay is like death. That evening, the Tsar peacefully played dominoes. Only on the 27th, when several military units rebelled, did Nicholas order loyal regiments to be sent to the capital from the fronts, and he himself set out to his family in Tsarskoye Selo. Neither these regiments nor the emperor himself reached their destination. Many historians consider the Tsar's departure from the headquarters his last fatal mistake. During 2 decisive days, the royal train was on the move, and Nicholas was powerless to influence the course of events. However, he could hardly have changed anything by then. Only on March 1st did the Tsar reach Pskov, where the headquarters of the Northern Front was located under the command of General Ruzsky. Ruzsky began to persuade Nicholas to come to an agreement with the Provisional Committee of the State Duma and allow the formation of a government responsible to the people's representatives. The same position was held by the Chief of Staff of the headquarters, General Alexeyev. Nicholas no longer had a choice. He surrendered. Immediately, the movement of frontline units to Petrograd was stopped on his behalf. The coming hours would show that the army leaders, like the Tsar, did not understand the essence of what was happening. They wanted to avoid major armed clashes and peacefully negotiate with the Provisional Committee, believing that it was leading a coup in favor of a constitutional monarchy. A direct-line conversation with Rodzianko sobered the generals. He explained that power was slipping from his hands and everyone was demanding the Tsar's abdication. Rodzianko himself was already under the supervision of representatives of the Council of Workers and Soldiers' deputies. On the evening of March 2nd, 2 members of the Provisional Committee of the Duma, Alexander Guchkov and Vasily Shulgin, arrived in Pskov and proposed that Nicholas abdicate in favor of his son. The Provisional Committee still hoped to calm the crowd and save the dynasty. Nicholas made the decision earlier in the day when all the front commanders spoke in favor of abdication. But he abdicated not in favor of his son, but in favor of his younger brother Michael. Nicholas II signed his last manifesto in a train carriage around midnight on March 2nd. The next day, Michael refused to accept the throne. Alexander Kerensky, the Minister of Justice of the newly formed provisional government, argued to Michael that accepting the throne would lead to the bloody collapse of Russia and that no one could guarantee the new Tsar's life. The rule of the Romanov dynasty, which lasted 304 years, ended. The tragedy of the Romanov family began. For 5 months, Nicholas, with his wife and children, would be under house arrest in Tsarskoye Selo. No one seriously attempted to save them. The provisional government lacked the resolve to free them from captivity. Their relatives, European monarchs, refused to accept them. Back then, none of them could imagine what the outcome would be. The Romanovs would travel from Tsarskoye Selo to distant Siberia, to Tobolsk, Rasputin's homeland. In August 17, the provisional government had reasons to believe it was ensuring the safety of the royal family. There were almost no Bolsheviks in Tobolsk. The Romanovs had 8 months to escape, but they didn't even try. Until the very end, they couldn't grasp what force had seized power in Russia. Even after learning about the Bolshevik coup, Nicholas asked why the crowd wasn't stopped, and why looting and destruction of wealth were allowed. In April 18, Soviet power reached Tobolsk. The Romanovs were taken to Yekaterinburg and placed in their final residence, the Ipatiev House. Here, they were destined to live their last 2.5 months. On July 20, 1918, the Presidium of the Ural Regional Soviet announced that 3 days earlier, Nicholas Romanov had been executed. The announcement did not mention that his wife, children, and several companions who stayed with them until the end also perished. Their tragic end opened a new chapter in Russian history, an era of unprecedented bloody political terror. Materials prepared by Alexander Eisenberg, Yulia Safonenko, Maxim Zolotukhin, Judy Ball Bruce. Script by Alexander Stepansky. Consultant, Nikolai Mitrofanov. Producers, John Dukas, Matthew King Kaufman, Maxim Zolotukhin. Directors, Alexander Eisenberg, Matthew King Kaufman. Archival documents provided by the Russian State Archive of Film and Photo Documents, Gostala Radiofond. Produced by Eastern Light Productions, Close Up by Castle Communications. The film was dubbed into Russian by NTV.